All right, good morning. No, it's not morning anymore. Good afternoon. My name is Pete Behrens. I'm coming to you from Boulder, Colorado, but I spend about 5 months a year in Europe, so quite comfortable with a lot of the European customs. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about leadership today and how your thinking can shape culture in your organization, and try to demystify a little bit of the concept of Agile and the concept of culture, and actually bring it down to a level where I think it might be impactful, both for you as well as your organization in a meaningful way. And what I'd like to do is start with just a brief story, maybe something that you can relate to, and something I think we've all seen before. And it starts with this concept of development, right? And essentially, if you work in development, my background is technical. I used to be a developer. You know, one of the things we get motivated by, one of the things we are incented to do is develop new features, right? Makes sense. The problem is when we are motivated and incented to develop new features, who gets in our way? Operations. Because what are they incented to do? Keep systems running. So every time we want to develop something, every time we want to produce something, they put a few checks and balances in our way to basically say, hey, not so fast. We want to make sure our systems are running. Every time you introduce something, you break it. And we don't like that so much, so we're going to put up a few gates for you. And so we get this a little bit of fight between development and operations, and I see this over and over again. I struggled with it as a developer, I struggled with it as a manager, and I see it as a coach working with organizations, this fight between these two well-intended goals that often get in the way. Well, I was working with an organization and we had this same challenge, and we were struggling with how do we actually solve this Pandora's box, or this challenge that we have between these two. And we came up with a really interesting result. We said, why don't we actually change incentives? Why don't we put the incentive of keeping systems running and give that to engineering, and take the incentive of new features and how many features you can get to market and give that to operations? And you know what they said? They said, whoa. We don't control that. How are we supposed to, if we can't control new features, how are we supposed to do that? Or if we can't control uptime, how are we supposed to do that? And we said, exactly, you can't. But what you told us before is you can't control it anyways, you keep complaining about the other side. And what this did, fascinatingly, it forced both groups to work together. You know, we call that DevOps today. But how do we actually get operations and development collaborating to accomplish a shared goal? And then basically focus on speeding up delivery. But we look at this from a system of, all I did is I changed one thing. I changed a metric. How do you get measured for how effective you are at your job? And I changed one variable and gave it a new look. Now, let me give you another example. This example comes from Salesforce, and maybe you might be familiar with Salesforce.com. And another example where I see a lot of organizations struggle is with this dichotomy between everybody doing the same thing. Maybe you're implementing SAFe, maybe everybody's on the same 2-week sprint, maybe everybody does story points the same way. We must do things identical. I work with other organizations where it's like, hey, you know, Spotify was just in the room, give each team freedom. We want each team to have choice. You can do Kanban, you can do Scrum, you can do a 1-week sprint, you can do a 4-week sprint. But just, you know, follow the Agile principles. You know, that turns out. I tried that. My very first coaching job back in 2005, I'm dating myself now, I've been coaching training for about 14 years now. I worked with an organization, we had 30 teams. I optimized them to me as a coach to be able to work with every team. And it was great for me, but leaders were saying, I can't see what's going on. I have no idea what's going on. All these teams are doing different things. I can't tell what's going on in the system. I see on the other side, and this is Salesforce's background, Salesforce.com, when I started coaching with them, they said, okay, we're concerned about too much tops down. I don't know if you've seen this. We don't want too much micromanagement. We don't want too much control. And so we were stuck in this dilemma. Do we give teams autonomy or do we control and keep things consistent. And again, we are stuck in this dilemma. What do we do? And what was fascinating coming out of this dialogue is we said, we need some consistency. So what we agreed at Salesforce was, we are going to dictate that every team delivers a value once a month. It's an agile value. Deliver something once a month. But inside that month, we're going to give you complete freedom to choose what you want to do. You could do 4 one-week sprints. You can do 2 two-week sprints. You could do Kanban. You could even do a 1-month waterfall. We don't care. What was fascinating about this is it changed the argument that I often see in organizations. Should we do Scrum? Should we do Kanban? Do we do story points? Should we do flow? It just took it off the table. We don't care what you do. What we care about is delivering value once a month. Who can argue against that? It's hard to argue against delivering value. And so we took that argument that I've seen in so many organizations, how do we do Agile? And it allowed that complete autonomy. And so what it allowed them to do is allowed teams to focus on how to deliver value to their customers. And that was the focus. So again, here is just how a single policy, right, just like our metric, a single policy can change the dimension from, hey, everybody doing safe, to complete freedom, to, hey, maybe we find an interesting balance. Salesforce, by the way, has been on a tear. Since about 2006, when they started their Agile transformation, they've gone through about 50 acquisitions, probably one of the fastest growing organizations in the world today. I'm not going to put all that on Agile. They're obviously doing some really good things, but Salesforce as an organization has an engine that's running incredibly powerfully. Now, why do we care about culture? Culture has been identified, maybe you've seen the reports, as the #1 impediment to organizational agility out there, right? Whether it shows up in resistance to change, whether it shows up into, the values don't align with Agile, or whether you're, seeing this as, this concept of management doesn't quite get it, right? Culture is an impediment, right? We know that. Now the question is, what is culture, right? One definition, culture is, what do we do around here, right? Now the way I want you to think about culture, though, is culture, since it's what do we do around here, what we do around here is driven by how we think around here. And what I'm trying to do with you is help you recognize your thinking drives culture. And how when you shift your thinking, you start to shift the culture, right? So I want to play a game with you. What I want you to do, first of all, is I would like you to stand up. And I know it's 2 o'clock. I know maybe you're tired. I need you to stand up, and I need you to find a partner. Everybody's got to find one other partner. Preferably in your row. If you're in different rows, please try to align on a row or an aisle, somewhere where you can move around. You need to be in the same row or aisle. If you would like to watch this game, that's fine, but it's more fun to play. Okay, now, what you're going to do is you're going to stand face to face with each other. All right, so we've got face-to-face partners working together. And imagine now there is a line between the two of you. One of you are on one side of the line, the other one's on the other side of the line, okay? Your goal is to win. Now, how do you win? You win by getting that person on the other side of that line to your side of the line. Now, hold on. There are 2 rules to this game. Rule number 1. No touching. Okay, you are not allowed to pull that person across the line. Okay, you can use words or any other form of convincing to get them on your side. Rule number 2, you have only 30 seconds to accomplish your goal. Go. So only 10 seconds left. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, time's up. Time's up. All right, you can go ahead and take a seat. Go ahead and take your seat. We got the energy in the room up here a little bit, didn't we? Okay, now, I'm not going to ask you because it might be a little difficult in this forum, but when I run this in a workshop, in a classroom setting, I have particular mindsets show up. And I saw a few of those behaviors right now. And I want to explain a few of these mindsets that maybe you saw yourself going through. The first mindset is a mindset we call the duality mindset. Did you find yourself in a little bit of a competitive situation? I've got to get you to cross this line, right? So what am I going to do? I'm going to hold firm on my side because my side's better, right? And the problem is, with both of you hold this mindset, I'm not going to give in, we end up with what we call a lose-lose situation. Anybody fall into the lose-lose situation? Nobody crossed the line. A few of you ran into this, right? This is something we call an expert mindset. I'm right. I know my side's better. I just need to convince you to come to my side. But I'm going to hold firm because I don't want to lose. Now, did you recognize I never said the word lose? I never said the word lose, did I? Yet in our mind, in a duality mindset, we often pit win versus lose, right versus wrong, black versus right, architecture A versus architecture B. You know, take your pick of problem, we put it into a duality. Now, some of you are a little bit more advanced than that, and you're saying, okay, I want to convince you. I'm going to persuade you, or even better, I want to manipulate you to come to my side. Now, I saw some money exchange hands over here. Anybody else find a bribe? Yeah, a few bribes that came out. Yeah, I've even seen in a classroom study somebody fake a seizure, believe it or not. It didn't work. Often bribes don't work because people can see through the bribe. I saw it worked in this case. Maybe the coffee worked. Yeah, but now we're thinking of this mindset of selling. I want to get your buy-in. It's better over here. Come on. Join me. This is something we call an achiever mindset, right? It's a little bit more advanced than the expert mindset, the duality. We recognize there's compromise. We recognize, hey, we can win together. Just come to my side. But I'm going to hold pretty firm still. I'm right. Now, some of you actually either bought into that or you took the mindset of sacrifice. These are my favorite people in the room. They were willing, whether there was a bribe or not, they were willing to cross the line because they felt there would be a win and we can win together. Anybody cross the line for your partner? Yeah, a few of you. You're my favorite types because you're recognizing now the concept that there's multiplicity here. There's not a win and a lose. I cross the line, I'm winning too. This is what we call that collaborative mindset where we work together to solve this problem. I'm willing to sacrifice for you. And some of you, I noticed, found the win-win. Who found that win-win? Oh, we got a lot of good agile minds in the room. Believe it or not, when I do this in a workshop, in some classes, 0 people cross the line. It's sad. But this is now recognized. The bottom 2 here basically use what's called a competitive mindset. The top 2 use what's called a collaborative mindset. It requires both of us to work together to accomplish these goals, so the goals are harder. Now recognize, in work too, things aren't black and white. Think of the 2 examples we just came up with. Creativity, innovation, and safety, reliability. We often pit these against each other, don't we? But we know there isn't one right. They're both right. Right? We can't just do one or the other. We don't have a business. The same is true with our second one. We can't have alignment and autonomy separately. We need them both. Just as Spotify and the great videos that they've created, or Henrik Nyberg created on Spotify culture, right? The concept of this both and, we need them both. Yet what we see in many organizations is we're pitting against each other. We're using a duality mindset with a convincing argument and a hold firm, which limits our ability to actually improve as an organization. And so what we need to consider is, how do you shift your mind from a either or to a both and? Now, let me just explain this in a big way with a CEO of Microsoft. I'm sure you're all familiar with them. Anybody here from Microsoft, since we have Microsoft as one of the people at one of the booths out there? Think about Microsoft, right? Microsoft, for a number of decades, when they were born, Bill Gates through Steve Ballmer had a very competitive mindset, right? Fight Netscape, fight Apple, fight Google, fight Motorola, fight everybody, right? And Steve Ballmer did this more than Bill Gates, right? They really hyped up the competitive game, win or lose. We're going to fight, we're going to win. And what happened in the early 2000s, they started to lose. Right? Now, I don't know if it's Steve Ballmer's fault, but during the Steve Ballmer era, Microsoft lost 36% of their stock price. Now, this was the dot-com bust, but think of Apple. During this period, they introduced the iPhone, they introduced the iPad, 2,000% growth. You can see the tale of two cultures going on here. Now, there's been a change at Microsoft. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's not only a change in culture, there's a change in strategy. Microsoft under Satya Nadella has said, why aren't we working with Apple? Why aren't we working with Google? Why aren't we working with some of these great companies? They have some of the best products. We should be collaborating with them, not competing with them. And what we've seen recently from Microsoft in the past 5 years is they've grown faster than Apple. And so what Satya Nadella is doing is taking this concept of a competitive duality culture to a competitive duality culture to a collaborative multiplicity culture. And it's paying off in spades for Microsoft. But what I want to illustrate to you is it doesn't require just the CEO to do this. In fact, that's probably the place where it's not going to happen. The reason is the risk grows as you go up higher in the organization. So most CEOs are not willing to take the risk of a Satya Nadella. So what do? My suggestion to you is you've got to take this risk. You've got to take this step, and you can shape culture at any level of the organization. And I want to show that to you. So let's talk first about being a Scrum Master, right? What is it like to be a Scrum Master in this mindset, right? So oftentimes I see Scrum Masters focus on the word commitment, right? We have a sprint plan, we commit to our sprint plan. What does that mean? It's usually a promise, right? So you come to your stakeholders at the end of a sprint and you say, well, we only got 70% of our sprint plan done. Stakeholders aren't happy, they push back. You can do better than that. So what we see with these teams is we see a lot of fear, we see a lot of pullback, we see a lot of slowness because they're like saying, okay, we'll commit to less. But they'll become quite predictable. Right? Now on the other end, we see some Scrum Masters who take this mindset of, let's focus on the forecast, right? We do Scrum, we do sprints, but it's a forecast, and a forecast can change. It's a guess. And what we see with a forecast in Scrum is the concept of stretching ourselves. Hey, if it's just a forecast, let's push. And the concept of change. We can change a forecast. And so what we see in terms of how this lays out in an organization, how this lays out in a team, is we see the effectiveness going up along the plan complete line, which is the percentage of complete inside of a sprint. And what we see is two spectrums. One is the undisciplined Agile. What I would say is these are the teams that just can't figure anything out. I don't think that's very effective. I don't know how much we're going to get done. I can't tell you what's going to get done. But on the other spectrum that I see more often, and especially organizations who want this discipline, want this control, they ask for commitment. And what we find is that you will get commitment at a very low rate. Now, as you work up the slippery slope here, you work into what we call a forecast. The 60 to 80% is the sweet spot. Now, to prove this out to you, to say this is true, look at Google. Google has something called an OKR. You may be familiar with that, an objective key result. Googlers and Google teams are targeted to 70% of their results. You think that pretty soft, isn't it? But what Google finds is they are trying to drive a competitive and a creative culture even as they scale. Because they don't want to lock things down too tightly because they recognize we're going to be in a lower performing bracket. Now, let's talk about your product owners, right? Your product owners shape cultures, and I often see product owners who want to be Steve Jobs. And if you're going to be Steve Jobs, great. Go be Steve Jobs. But I don't find most people effective at being Steve Jobs other than Steve Jobs. I think Steve Jobs is pretty damn good. He knew better than customers. He knew better than most people. And he could manipulate the heck out of anybody and was right usually. The problem with product owners is they want to be Steve Jobs. They think they know or they think they should know. And what does that lead to? They get back into that expert mindset. I know what we need. Often they're wrong. The other thing they try to do is they try to orchestrate the knowing. They try to be the conduit between all the stakeholders. And I talk to a lot of product owners. What do? They go to stakeholder A. Hey, we need all this. They go to stakeholder B. Hey, we need all this. And then they come back to the team. Hey, guys, we're going to do all this. And the team's pushing back. We can't do all this. Blah, blah. and they get knocked around like a ping pong ball on a table, and they get frustrated. It's not working. I can't figure out this problem. Because they either know or they want to know, and they try to fix all the problems. But even product owners moving into the, hey, we know, change the game, right? Product owners who take the mindset of, hey, we know, start to connect teams to stakeholders, which is what Scrum should be, and they start to create a co-creative approach to solving problems. I'm not the answer. As product owner, I'm not the one who has to know. I'm the one who has to get everybody together to make sure we know what to do. And effective product ownership, whether you know it or not, I've been a Scrum trainer and coach for many, many years. I don't teach it anymore because I get too frustrated because every Scrum team says, management doesn't understand. So now I teach leadership. But I used to teach Scrum. And product owners who take a co-creative approach, meaning their job is to get the knowledge in the room, outperform product owners who don't. So you're thinking right now, I get it. I got the answer, Pete. Up is good, down is bad, right? No, you got it wrong. But that's okay because I've kind of purposely manipulated you to think up is good and down is bad. What I want you to think about is inside is healthy, outside is unhealthy. Now, what does this look like, right? What this looks like, essentially, look at our Scrum Master, right? Our Scrum Master, I see a lot of poor Scrum Mastership, and how this might show up is what I'd call the Scrum Nazi. That's not Scrum. We do 1, 2, 3, 5, 8 story points, not bilinear story points. We do 2-week sprints, and we have to do a sprint plan that looks like this, right? That's our Scrum dictator. But I also see the Scrum Master that you ask them any question, they're like, it depends. You ever had that coach come at you? It's like, I've heard this, Pete, does every coach just get trained to respond? It depends. It's not very useful. And I see a lot of Scrum Masters and coaches who have no answers. And that can be just as frustrating in that role. Now, you got your Scrum Masters who push on velocity. Go, go, go. We got to win this sprint. All right, we're gonna have it all done this sprint. And I get those other Scrum Masters who say, hey, we're a team. Everybody's got to do every task. Developers test, testers develop. Everybody does design, right? Which we know that can be a problem as well. But when you think about Scrum Mastership and effective Scrum Mastership, these are the words that come to mind. Does anybody recognize where these words come from? That's my first question to you. Yeah, somebody's an answer in the room. The Scrum values. Respect for people and teams. The openness to not be right. The commitment to work together as that team, and the focus that we need to make sure we're focused on the right things, and the courage to do all these things, right? So when I'm looking at a Scrum Master, it's incredibly balanced, but you take it a step too far and you become quite dysfunctional. Now, there's another balance here that's going on, this balance of power style. And this is something as we move into leadership, development managers, test managers, functional managers, directors, VPs, I see power style come into play. But it can also be true with architects or any other lead that might be a technical lead. There's this balance of assertiveness and accommodateness. And we've often been taught assertiveness is good leadership, especially for men. Men, if you're assertive, you're a strong leader. Tell people what to do. But then we say, well, Agile's about servant leadership. I need to support you as a team. I need to be here and enable you to co-create. And often, I know it's gender biased, but often we treat women who play an accommodative role, oh, you're a good leader. But if you're an assertive role, that's kind of bitchy. And for men, it's just the opposite. If you're assertive, you're a good leader. And if you're accommodative, oh, you're just too soft. You can't make a decision, right? It's a terrible thing, but it happens. And what we think about is, yes, an accommodative leader is patient and listens. But you know what? You take that accommodativeness a step too far, and what happens? It becomes pretty slow and weak. It's also true of accommodative leader giving you space and allowing you to be creative and give you choice and autonomy. But you take that too far, and we run into just, what am I supposed to do? Right? Just as on the bottom half, we have assertive leaders who make decisive, quick action. Let's move, let's go. But you go too far, and we leave people behind. We create too much intensity that people feel frustrated. And finally, yes, having a direct and structured work is great, but you take that too far, and all of a sudden you've got your micromanager who's telling everybody what to do. So again, what we're seeing here is we're seeing the healthy and we're seeing the unhealthy. And what we're seeking here is the balance, not the fact that one is better than the other. And so this is what I get frustrated a lot with a lot of Agile leadership training. We teach you to be the servant leader, the accommodative leader, when in fact it's not assertiveness or accommodativeness, it's the balance that we're looking for. So I want to talk just a minute about Google. We mentioned Google and their 70% OKRs. That seems a little bit odd. What are they doing here? Google with the 70% OKR is actually purposely creating what they call a stretch and a adaptive style. What they want Googlers to do is push themselves, challenge themselves, but also it's okay to change the plan. Now, the other interesting thing about Google, they have another policy. I don't know if you know the policy, but the policy is around every line of code in Google is code reviewed. And the reason they do this is a lot of organizations will take that test function and push it into a specific role. And at Google, they say no. I don't know if you've looked at any testing job at Google, but usually the top line of the testing job says this is not a typical testing job. You will look at code, you will write code, you will analyze code, you will change code. This is an engineering job. Yes, they have testers at Google, but testers are developers. And so what they're doing at Google is they don't want handoffs. They want Googlers to be able to analysis, design, code, test. They want individuals to be able to work through the whole thing, and they want to be able to share responsibility. And again, what Google's trying to do is trying to find the balance with the fewest number of policies as possible. And so something like all code reviewed is a very straightforward policy, or 70% OKR is a but they only have a couple of them, right? They only do a few policies, but they do it everywhere in the organization. Let me give you just a personal example of my company and myself. I'm the owner of a small boutique consulting practice in Boulder, Colorado. Right? We have about 10 employees. We focus on organizational agility, leadership education. We run a community called the Agile Leadership Journey Community. And what we try to do is we try to enable organizations to drive through this process. But we have a problem too, because my bias focuses on the right side of this matrix. And so what I'm often doing is I'm creating new stuff, right? And I'm pushing the company really hard to kind of do all these new things. And what that tends to do is it leaves everybody else behind. And that works if it's just Pete. That works if it's just a couple of us. But as we've grown, we've realized that this doesn't work unless it has a balancing matrix. And so what I had to do, what I'm doing is essentially I need to hire that COO and that operations person to be able to focus on the here and the now. And so we have people specifically focused in our company that are focused on the community that we build. How are we working together? And focused on how are we operating and running together. So it doesn't have to be that you as an individual, and this is what I often talk to a lot of leaders about, I have to be everything to everybody. No, you don't. Know your strengths. My strength is in blue and green. I recognize my weakness. I hire for my weakness so that we can have both. But if I don't respect, and by the way, a good portion of that yellow and red happens to be my wife. And I've learned if I don't respect that yellow and red, I'm in trouble. Not only from a marriage, but from a business, right? And if you don't respect what you're not good at, if you don't respect the other side of the matrix, it breaks down, right? So what we've been exploring so far is what we call the shape of culture. If you've recognized this framework, it's something called the competing values framework. It's been around for about 30 years. It's been around and studied in thousands of organizations. This is nothing new I'm sharing with you. But what I find it to be incredibly necessary for organizations trying to be more agile and leaders trying to be more effective in the leadership style to understand this, to grow their own self-awareness and the organization's awareness. To give you a couple examples of what this looks like, basically going back to Salesforce, when we look at Salesforce, Salesforce is a highly competitive organization. But for them to be more effective, they needed to be more collaborative and they needed to be more creative to actually grow, because what we found when they were scaling up in the early 2000s, they had all the individual heroism, but not the team heroism. So what did we do? We basically said the team is more valuable than the individual, and we rewarded the teams. In fact, we created a competitive team environment where teams would beat other teams to be better. right? Now that could get dysfunctional. You got to be careful about that. So just be knowing you can swing the pendulum too far. But the other thing we did at Salesforce is we gave every employee, and I saw this in one of the other talks here. I think it was our other leadership talk. She said we give them a stop card. And at Salesforce, they called this tops down. They said, we're allowing every employee to say, hey, tops down. We don't do that around here. Managers are not allowed to tell employees what to do. That comes through the team. So they gave essentially every employee the tops down card to call out their manager. That's not okay. That's not what we're doing around here to enable a more creative, autonomous culture. Now, at Google that we just talked about is often Google is over creative. They're over autonomous. They're over free to do what they want to do. And actually adding structure to Google helps. Now, I've worked mostly on the internal side of Google, something they call Corp-Eng, short for corporate engineering. That's their IT organization. What they find successful actually is moving from actually adding sprints and teams, number one, creates structure, improves performance at Google. And number two, what we find is moving from individual OKRs to team OKRs has created a much more effective structure and helps their productivity in terms of delivery. And finally, just to give you another example here, a healthcare organization, and often banking, insurance, retail, healthcare, transportation, traditional, what we'd call control-structured cultures need a bit more creativity, a bit more speed, and so things around adaptation, things around creating focused cross-functional teams, et cetera, are things that help those cultures. So, what did we do here? We talked about the fact that culture is what we do around here, but what we do around here is driven by how we think around here. And so what Agile organizations need is Agile leaders who are helping them think. So I'm encouraging you to be an Agile leader. Now, what does that mean? When we teach Agile leadership in our community, we focus on 4 dimensions. And what we look at is we start with your mindset, right? And how do you think? And what we recognize is your mindset drives your behavior, and your behavior starts to drive the culture and starts to drive the delivery in the organization. And so what we've been focused on here is what we call the values framework. But behind the values framework, if you want to hold your pictures, there's a couple more that are going to pop up here. What's behind the framework is this mindset that I've been focusing on, what we call the expert mindset, that duality, the achiever mindset of the compromise and trying to get that persuasive element, and the catalyst mindset of the open collaborative balance that we look for. So what we teach, and you can take a picture if you like, what we teach basically is we teach skill sets around each of these dimensions, the cultural dimension, the mindset dimension, right? The behaviors it takes to actually live these things out, both in the leader and in the organization. And what we're finding is that these tools, both the self-awareness tools and the behavior tools, are driving an increase in effectiveness through the organization. And this community that we're building, something called the Agile Leadership Journey, is something that we're growing worldwide. And in a sense, we've got just 25 educators and coaches today across the globe in Europe, Asia, India, and US. And we're continuing to seek those that want to continue this journey with us. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'll open it up to questions if you have some questions about the talk today. Okay, so the question was, what do I see as far as challenges when engaging leaders with how to approach any of this topic? The number one thing that we see with leadership is awareness, self-awareness. Most leaders that we talk about this concept of the expert mindset, dual mindset, the manipulative mindset of bribing somebody else, are typically subconscious. right? And so they're typically something that basically happens without even me being aware that I'm doing those things. And so one of the first things we start to talk about is creating self-awareness, right? Both in the leadership, what do I focus on? What are my behaviors? What is the assertive accommodative balance, right? So that's the individual challenge. Now, the second challenge is the system, right? What are leaders rewarded for? Get the project done, meet the budget, deliver the results, right? And this drives what we call an achiever mindset, right? So there's most incentive systems in an organization drive achiever leaders. And in fact, most leadership 360s that leaders take, they get most rewarded being what we call achievers. Now, we go back basically to that previous picture. What we see in those achiever leaders, just to kind of show you the picture there again, is in a sense the middle leader definition that we talk about, that basically this concept of the achiever being right, the achiever knowing, the achiever guiding those solutions, works effectively in what we call complicated workspaces. But as we get into what we call complex, most of you I'd argue are in complex spaces where you're dealing with customers, dealing with feedback. That's where we see this catalyst leadership. So to answer your question in summary, self-awareness, number one, and then the organizational system rewarding that type of leadership that's less effective. Other questions? One way in the back, I can barely see you. Yeah. So let me repeat the question as I heard it, just for everybody's in the video as well. So the question is, as we illustrate this balance, does this represent compromise? And is that compromise, I guess, realistic? Number one, and is that the goal? And maybe number two. Is that a fair interpretation? And is it possible? Yeah. So a little bit behind the model. The research in the model talks about when we think about these four quadrants, we think about that we're only as effective as our weakest quadrant, right? So in a sense, it doesn't mean we need to have an equal portion of every single one, but in a sense, when you think about StrengthsFinder, and they often talk about, build your strengths. This model kind of talks about the fact that, yeah, you can continue to build a strength, but two things happen. One is if you take a strength too far, it could turn into a weakness. So for example, I take, this autonomy too far, and all of a sudden, I don't give people enough direction, right? Or I take my, clearness of where it is we're going that people need, and all of a sudden I become a dictator, right? So it's recognizing that a strength might turn bad. And number two, that when I have a gap or when I have a weakness, my overall leadership and the overall organization is weak based on that kind of the weakest link kind of theory. And so whether this is an individual or whether this is a team or whether this is an organizational system, what we talk about is we talk about the healthy balance and how to continue to strive for that balance. And like I said, sometimes that means I work on my personal, just as an example, right? One of the things that I'm working on continuously is my bias is assertive. I'm easily can share my opinion. I can easily quickly assume what's going on. I can quickly ascertain, and I'm usually thinking ahead of everybody else. But what that leads to is, people feeling shut down, people not feeling like they can contribute, but doesn't feel like they can keep up. So for me to be actually a more effective leader, what I've had to do is I've had to learn how to check that, how to be more curious, ask more questions, slow down a little bit to understand where maybe I'm going a little too quickly, maybe I'm going a little too fast, maybe I'm making too many assumptions. And so my balance improves, my leadership improves when I'm starting to invoke that balance. But just as much I work with leaders who are patient, kind, engaging. They ask questions. And they can be just as ineffective. In that when they share an opinion, when they speak up, when they have a voice, when they provide a little bit more direction, they improve their leadership too. So yes, it's possible. Yes, it's a challenge. Basically, I don't know if I answered every part of that question, but I think we got most of it. Yeah. I don't know. What is our timing? Are we okay on time? Okay. Yeah. Oh, the game we played, yes. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, and you're reminding me of something I didn't answer in the first question, that is this concept of compromise. And is that what we're shooting for here? And in fact, no, that's not what we're shooting for. And I meant to answer that part of your question too. When we played that game and when we think about compromise, one of the researchers that I love the most actually was in the 1900s. She hung around Boston and Harvard, but they weren't allowing women in Harvard, so she didn't actually go to Harvard, but she played around there a lot. Person by the name of Mary Parker Follett, she describes this concept of conflict. We have a conflict. We have difference of opinion. We have whatever it is, right? I see things differently than you. And she talks about we have like 4 options. We fight, like we just talked about. I want to win, you want to win. We fight. One of us might win or lose, right? Or there's a lose-lose like we talked about. And she recognizes that's a little bit dysfunctional and not very effective at creative problem solving. She says the second one is I submit. And that's kind of like the person who sacrificed. She actually says that's a pretty weak form because we actually we don't come up with anything new creative, we just give in, right? So that submission is actually just as weak as the fight. And you can see that here. The assertive is the fight. The submission is the I just give in, the accommodative. Now, then she goes on further and she says compromise is often set up as the solution. Let's find a compromise. But what she actually says is compromise is not effective. And the reason she says compromise is not effective, she says it's only as valuable as the current solution. And as soon as the environment changes, the compromise is broken. It's like balance of power. She says compromise is like, I'll give you this, you give me that, or I'll give you this win now, you give me a win later. There's a give and a take, quid pro quo, as is in the news today. We give each other something. But what she says is nobody has changed their mind. And so the difference between compromise and integrate is a big step. Integrate means I, in my mind, am rethinking of the solution. I'm realizing there's limits to my solution. I'm realizing that I'm right only partially, that it's like immigration today. Is immigration good? Is immigration bad? Yes, yes. Is closing walls and borders good or bad? Yes, yes. I mean, it's a complex problem. And most of our technical problem domain is complex. And so this construct of give and take, this concept of compromise doesn't actually change minds. And so what we look at here in this Catalyst leadership is starting to move from I know how, I know what, to I may not know. And that courage to be vulnerable, the courage to not know, is what creates the space for agility. And that's kind of the key here. So I want to thank you. You guys have been a great audience. Feel free.